December 1940 was not just cold in Britain, it was cruel. The kind of cold that clings to stone walls and seeps through wool coats. The kind of cold that makes the air feel heavy, as if the sky itself has weight. And in that dark, freezing month, the future of Western civilization did not feel secure. It felt precarious, like a rope stretched too thin, fraying strand by strand, with every passing hour pulling it closer to snapping. Britain had already endured what many believed would be impossible. In the summer of 1940, the Royal Air Force had fought the Battle of Britain and won. Those weeks had been a blur of exhaustion and courage. Young pilots scrambling into cockpits with barely enough time to breathe, climbing into skies filled with Messerschmitts and Heinkels, climbing again and again until bodies and machines were worn down to the edge. They were outnumbered, they were stretched, but they held, and they turned back Germany's daylight assault. Victory in the air should have been the turning point. It should have meant relief. Instead, it meant the beginning of something worse. The Blitz. Because Hitler, denied his quick knockout, shifted tactics. If Britain could not be broken by invasion, then Britain would be broken by terror, attrition, and exhaustion. Night after night, the bombers came. Not in a single dramatic strike, but as a relentless routine, wave after wave, week after week. The explosions became the country's new clock. The sirens were the evening bell. The glow of fires became a second sunrise. London burned, not as metaphor, but as fact. Entire streets disappeared under collapsing brick and molten glass. Whole districts were reduced to ash and rubble. The ancient Guildhall was gutted. Warehouses exploded along the river. Underground stations became shelters crowded with the living, and haunted by the fear that the tunnels might become tombs. And above it all, St. Paul's Cathedral remained standing, its dome rising through smoke and flame, silhouetted against an orange sky. Photographs captured it like an icon of resistance, faith and stone refusing to yield. That image would travel the world and define the spirit of an era, but symbols could not intercept bombs. Photographs could not repair factories. Cathedrals could not keep ships afloat. The Luftwaffe was not only targeting morale, it was targeting function. Coventry was smashed with systematic brutality. Its medieval cathedral burned into a skeletal ruin in a single night of horror. Liverpool's docks, lifelines for Atlantic convoys, were attacked like arteries meant to be severed. Birmingham, Manchester, Sheffield, industrial engines that fed Britain's war machine, were pounded because Germany understood that in a modern war, the front line isn't only trenches. It's production, it's shipping, it's supply. Now picture the map hanging in the cabinet war rooms beneath Whitehall. On paper, the British Empire still looked vast, a quarter of the globe tinted in imperial color, stretching from Canada to Australia, from India to the African continent, from the Caribbean islands to far Pacific territories. Roughly 450 million people under the crown. It was the largest empire human history had ever assembled. But that map was a kind of illusion. Because in those cramped underground rooms, smoke-filled, crowded, lit by the harsh glow of lamps, Britain's leaders carried a secret that could not be printed in newspapers or broadcast on the BBC. A truth too dangerous for public morale. The empire was not only bleeding men, it was bleeding money. And worse, its financial lifeblood was draining away so fast that even victory in the skies could not stop what was coming. Winston Churchill, the man who had turned language into weaponry, now had to do something he despised. He had to plead. Not for sympathy, not for compliments, for survival. In December 1940, Churchill sat at his desk underground and wrote one of the most important letters of his life. It was addressed to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, President of the United States, the leader of the world's richest neutral power. Churchill was no ordinary writer. He could take despair and reshape it into defiance. He had promised blood, toil, tears, and sweat. He had declared Britain would fight on beaches and landing grounds, in fields and streets, and never surrender. His voice traveled through radios like a lifeline. He was the man who kept Britain standing. But in this letter, he had to perform an awkward, humiliating dance. He had to tell Roosevelt, in careful language, that Great Britain, the banker of the 19th century, the workshop of the world, the empire that had defeated Napoleon and dominated global trade, was approaching bankruptcy. The letter, dated December 8, 1940, was detailed and strategic. Churchill laid out the military situation. He described the submarine peril in the Atlantic. He explained why Britain urgently needed destroyers to protect convoys, aircraft to replace losses, weapons and ammunition in volumes British factories could not supply fast enough. And then, beneath the strategy, came the sting. Churchill admitted that the moment was approaching when the British Treasury would no longer be able to pay cash for the supplies Britain needed to stay alive. The spirit of the people remained unbroken, he insisted. But spirit could not stop tanks, courage could not manufacture shells, resolve could not refuel ships. Britain could fight, but Britain could no longer afford to buy the tools of fighting. It was a plea wrapped in a briefing, an insolvency notice disguised as national strategy, a confession of weakness written by the proud leader of a proud nation. And that letter forces a question that still stuns when you look at it closely. How did the richest empire on earth reach the edge of financial collapse? At the start of the war in September 1939, Britain still looked like a financial titan. The Bank of England held vast reserves. Britain's overseas investments were immense, built up over centuries of trade and imperial dominance. British firms and individuals owned assets across the world, railways in South America, mines in Africa and Latin America, plantations in Asia, and major holdings inside the United States itself. London was still a global finance capital. Insurance markets centered there. Shipping networks ran through there. Sterling was still one of the world's great financial pillars. Britain had the reputation of stability, creditworthiness, and wealth. But Hitler's war was not the kind of war Britain had prepared for. This was not a limited campaign or a short burst of combat meant to be resolved by treaties. It was a grinding industrial furnace, a war of machines, logistics, materials, and production, where victory belonged to the side that could outbuild and outsupply the other. Steel, oil, aluminum, rubber, copper, explosives, those weren't just commodities now, they were survival. A single bomber required enormous industrial inputs, precision engineering, specialized metals, vast fuel consumption, replacement parts and train labor. Tanks devoured steel and fuel. Artillery fired shells by the tens of thousands. Modern war didn't merely cost money, it consumed entire economies. And Britain had a structural weakness that became deadly. Britain imported much of what it needed. Food, fuel, raw materials. The island depended on maritime trade. Britain imported large portions of its food supply. Britain had no significant domestic oil reserves. Britain relied on global shipping lanes for the basics of life and the components of war. As Germany conquered Europe, Britain lost access to traditional trading partners. France fell. The Low Countries were occupied. Scandinavia became contested or closed. Large parts of the continent became enemy territory. Britain's survival now depended on looking west, across the Atlantic to the United States. And that's where the economic trap snapped shut. America in 1940 was officially neutral. It was also politically allergic to the idea of being dragged into another European bloodbath. The memory of World War I remained vivid. A generation killed in foreign mud, communities marked by memorials, families shaped by grief. Public opinion leaned isolationist. Congress reflected that mood through the Neutrality Acts, laws designed to prevent America from becoming entangled again. Those laws forbade direct loans to nations at war and restricted forms of assistance. But there was one loophole, and it became Britain's lifeline and Britain's financial death spiral: cash and carry. It meant Britain could buy American supplies, food, oil, steel, aircraft, weapons, but only if it paid immediately in cash or gold. and Britain had to transport goods in its own ships, risking U-boats in the Atlantic. America would sell, but America would not lend. No credit, no long-term financing, gold on the barrelhead, so Britain paid and paid and paid. For the first year of the war, Britain bled its reserves into American dockyards and factories. Every crate had a price. Every aircraft came with a bill. Every shipment meant dollars transferred and gold shipped. After the fall of France in 1940, Britain's position became desperate. The country stood alone against a continent dominated by Nazi power. That was when Britain executed one of the most dramatic financial operations in its history, Operation Fish. It was secrecy and desperation fused into one event. Britain moved vast amounts of gold and negotiable securities across the Atlantic to Canada, loading wealth onto ships, escorting it through submarine-infested waters, placing it in North American vaults so it could be used to pay for war materials. It was the empire sending its treasure into exile. It was a breathtaking act of risk, because if even a portion of that wealth had been sunk at sea, Britain would have been ruined instantly. But Britain had no choice. It had to keep paying. And still, it wasn't enough. By late 1940, the liquid gold was vanishing. The easy-to-sell assets were gone or close to it. Britain's purchasing officials in Washington found themselves stuck. Contracts they couldn't sign, orders they couldn't finalize because London's message was simple and terrifying. There were no dollars left. Aircraft manufacturers could deliver, but demanded payment. Steel mills would supply, but required cash. The machinery of war does not run on sympathy. This was the background to Churchill's letter. Britain wasn't merely short on supplies. Britain was close to being unable to buy supplies at all. When Roosevelt received Churchill's message, he understood the stakes instantly. Britain falling would mean Germany controlling Europe's resources, industries, coastlines, and strategic positions. That would create a world in which the United States would eventually face a hostile superpower across an ocean that no longer looked protective. But Roosevelt faced a political reality at home. He could not simply send money. The laws and the mood of the country would not allow it. Aid could not look like charity. It could not look like a blank check. It had to look like something practical, something framed as American self-interest. So Roosevelt and his administration developed a new concept, Lend-Lease. The marketing mattered. The story mattered. Roosevelt needed language that would make Americans accept the idea. He offered a folksy analogy. If your neighbor's house is on fire, you don't stand there arguing over the cost of a hose. You lend the hose. You help put out the fire. Later, when the emergency is over, you get your hose back. It sounded generous, simple, and temporary. But that public image, friendly neighbors, hid the private reality. Because in Washington, behind closed doors, the negotiations felt less like borrowing a garden hose and more like a bank examining a desperate client's last remaining assets. The U.S. Treasury Secretary, Henry Morgenthau Jr., was anti-Nazi and wanted Britain to survive. But he also saw himself as guardian of American taxpayers, and he feared one political nightmare above all others, that Britain would accept American aid while quietly preserving hidden wealth. So Morgenthau demanded proof, not vague proof, not polite assurances, documentation. He demanded an accounting of British assets across the world, government holdings, foreign reserves, investments owned by private British citizens, industrial stakes, income streams, supplies, inventories. Britain was pushed to open its books to a foreign government at the worst moment of its life. British negotiators were stunned. This was not how allies behaved. Britain was fighting for civilization, under bombardment, and yet was being treated like a failing corporation pleading for bailout funds. The British tried to argue. They explained they had already liquidated gold, already spent huge reserves. They warned that selling long-term investments in wartime would be a fire sale, pennies on the pound. They insisted those overseas assets were not luxuries, but the foundation of Britain's post-war recovery. Those investments produced income that paid for imports. Selling them would help now and cripple Britain later. But Morgenthau was unmoved, and politics reinforced him. Isolationists in Congress attacked Lend-Lease as a trick, claiming Britain was richer than it admitted. Morgenthau wanted visible sacrifice, something dramatic that could be shown as proof Britain had truly emptied its pockets. This is where the story becomes less romantic and more brutal, because survival demanded liquidation. British-owned assets in the United States became targets. Profit-making enterprises, long-term investments built up over generations, were suddenly treated as bargaining chips. One of the most bitterly remembered cases involved American Viscose, an enormous U.S. industrial producer associated with rayon manufacture and British ownership through Courtaulds. To Britain, it represented something precious, a profitable asset in the U.S. generating hard currency income that could support Britain's trade balance. To Washington, it represented something else, a pile of money Britain could be forced to turn into dollars immediately. Under heavy pressure, the asset was effectively pushed into sale conditions where everyone knew Britain was desperate. And in finance, desperation is weakness, and weakness gets priced into the deal. Distressed sales do not fetch fair value. They fetch what buyers can squeeze out of sellers who have no alternative. That's how fire sales work. The seller's urgency becomes the buyer's leverage. The result, seen from London, felt like losing property under duress. The proceeds went into paying for war orders. Britain carried the cost and the bitterness. To many British officials, this was when the romantic idea of equal partnership began to crack. Britain needed American aid, yes, but the aid came with terms that peeled away Britain's remaining wealth. And it didn't stop with companies. The liquidation expanded into strategy itself. Britain's need wasn't only money and supplies. It was ships, especially destroyers, to protect convoys from submarines. German U-boats were the silent executioners of Britain's economy. Every ship sunk meant fewer calories, less fuel, fewer raw materials, fewer replacement parts. It meant factories starved of inputs and civilians pushed toward rationing. Churchill pressed Roosevelt hard for destroyers, old American vessels from World War I, sitting idle. Roosevelt agreed to transfer 50 of them, but he demanded payment, not in money, in geography. The deal, destroyers for bases, gave the United States long-term rights to build and operate military bases on British territory across the Atlantic and Caribbean, Newfoundland, Bermuda, Jamaica, Trinidad, and more. These weren't symbolic outposts. They were strategic nodes that would project power across the hemisphere for decades. Think about the shape of that trade. Britain handed America a web of forward positions, a strategic footprint, in exchange for ships that were outdated even as they arrived. It was a classic bargain of desperation. Long-term assets traded for short-term survival. Britain did it because it had to, because the Atlantic was being choked, because the war couldn't be paused for fairer terms. But the pattern was unmistakable. When Britain needed help, Britain paid, in cash, in companies, in bases, in influence. When Lend-Lease was passed, it did save Britain's war effort. It brought fuel, trucks, aircraft, food, raw materials, everything Britain needed to keep going. Without it, the blockade might have starved Britain into submission or forced Britain to negotiate under unbearable conditions. Publicly, Lend-Lease became a moral story. America helping democracy, the arsenal of democracy supplying the fight against tyranny. And in many ways, that's true. But the arrangement also reshaped the post-war world. Because embedded inside it was a quiet insistence that Britain's old imperial trade protections would not survive the alliance. Britain's empire was not only military, it was economic. It was held together by systems like imperial preference, tariffs, and trade rules that favored intra-empire commerce. Those rules protected British industry by giving British goods privileged access to empire markets. To American policymakers committed to free trade, and committed to expanding American exports. That system was an obstacle, so Britain faced pressure to dismantle it. The clauses weren't dramatic like bombs. They were written in diplomatic language, the kind that seems harmless until you understand the consequences. But the meaning was clear enough. If Britain wanted aid now, Britain would have to open markets later. Britain resisted. British officials knew what they were being asked to surrender. But with German bombers overhead and U-boats hunting in the Atlantic, Britain's bargaining position was limited to one word: yes. This is the cruel truth of wartime economics. When you are drowning, you do not negotiate the price of the rope. As the war moved into 1942 and beyond, especially after Pearl Harbor, Britain and America became full allies in the battlefield sense. American troops flowed into Britain, airfields multiplied. The island became a giant platform for the eventual invasion of Europe, but economically the imbalance widened. America's industrial base exploded. The U.S. could produce staggering amounts of military hardware. It also maintained large parts of civilian production and expanded its global commercial reach. Its cities were not bombed. Its factories were intact. Its infrastructure was not shattered. Britain's economy, by contrast, was bent almost entirely toward war. Civilian production was reduced. Exports fell sharply. British factories that once made goods for global markets now made only what the war demanded. And global markets do not wait. As British exporters vanished from Latin America, Asia, and the Middle East, American firms stepped in. Distribution networks shifted. Customer relationships changed. Contracts were reassigned. Brands were displaced. The commercial ground Britain had occupied for generations slowly filled with someone else's product. So Britain was fighting the war and, in a sense, surrendering its commercial future. Not from failure of courage, from necessity. By 1944-45, global financial weight had shifted. Gold reserves accumulated in the U.S. dollar dominance was rising. Britain's wartime debts and depleted reserves left it vulnerable. Then came the war's end, and Britain discovered that victory does not automatically pay the bills. Britain celebrated the end of the war as though the world had exhaled for the first time in 6 years. Crowds gathered, flags waved, bonfires burned. People danced in the streets. The nightmare was over, but in Washington the mood was colder, more administrative. Within days of Japan's surrender, the U.S. terminated Lend-Lease sharply. The aid flow, Britain's economic oxygen, stopped. Shipments were halted. Some cargoes were recalled. Britain was stunned. Many in London had assumed there would be a transition, a runway to convert back to peacetime production and rebuild exports. Britain's economy had been turned into a war machine. It couldn't instantly become a peacetime trading engine again. It needed time, but time was not granted. Britain faced a brutal reality. It still imported huge quantities of food and raw materials. During the war, Lend-Lease and wartime arrangements had supported those imports. Now Britain had to pay, and Britain had no dollars, no reserves, no easy options. This created what Keynes described as a financial emergency on the scale of Dunkirk. Britain did not merely risk hardship. Britain risked systemic collapse, so Britain had to do the unthinkable again. It had to beg. John Maynard Keynes, the era's most influential economist, traveled to Washington seeking relief. He was ill and exhausted, his heart already weakened. He believed Britain had a moral case. Britain had held out alone for years, had sacrificed massively, had fought for a cause that benefited the entire free world. Keynes hoped America would recognize that and provide a grant, a true rescue, a recognition of shared struggle. But the war had ended and politics changed with it. American voters wanted demobilization, not more spending on Europe. Congress was wary. Some politicians were suspicious of Britain's new Labour government and its plans for nationalization. The American mood was not sentimental. It was tired and transactional. Keynes met American officials who listened, then offered a loan, not a gift, a loan with interest and conditions. Britain had no leverage to refuse. Starvation and industrial collapse were not theoretical threats. They were near-term dangers. So Britain accepted a loan. And with that loan came one of the most damaging conditions imaginable: sterling convertibility. The condition sounded technical, even reasonable to outsiders. Make the pound convertible. Open the currency. Let holders exchange sterling for dollars. But Britain's wartime system had created huge sterling balances held by countries in Britain's trading network and empire. Britain had paid for supplies and support during the war with pounds, but had restricted conversion into dollars. This kept the system stable and protected Britain's scarce reserves. If convertibility were suddenly allowed, those holders would rush to exchange pounds for dollars, because dollars bought American goods, and American goods were dominant. Keynes warned it would cause a run on sterling. Britain implemented convertibility in 1947 under loan terms, and the run came fast and brutal. Reserves hemorrhaged. Dollars drained out at alarming speed. The loan, meant to cushion Britain for years, evaporated in weeks. Britain was forced to suspend convertibility, slamming the window shut in humiliation. It was a national lesson written in numbers. Britain could no longer operate as the financial center it once was. The pound could no longer carry the world on its back. Britain had entered a new era, a poorer era. Economic weakness quickly became strategic retreat. Britain could no longer afford to police global commitments the way it once had. In 1947, Britain informed the United States it could no longer support Greece and Turkey against communist pressures. America stepped in with the Truman Doctrine. That moment wasn't just diplomacy. It was the symbolic transfer of responsibility from the exhausted empire to the rising superpower. The post-war world rearranged itself. Britain's empire began to unravel, not only from nationalist pressure, which was real and powerful, but from financial reality. Holding territories costs money: administration, security forces, infrastructure, investment. Britain could not pay for empire the way it once had. Austerity at home became severe. Rationing continued long after peace. In fact, some conditions worsened. Bread rationing arrived in peacetime, an extraordinary marker of how hard the economic situation remained. In 1949, Britain devalued the pound, an admission written into the exchange rate that Britain was no longer the old Britain. It had won the war, but it had not won the peace. And the cost did not end in the 1940s. Britain's post-war debts lasted for decades. Payments continued long after Churchill's era, long after wartime children became elderly adults. Britain continued servicing obligations tied to survival itself. The psychological consequence lingered too: a national sense of diminished power, a feeling, sometimes spoken, sometimes unspoken, that Britain had stepped down from the world's center stage. That is why the phrase "special relationship" carries a shadow. It sounds friendly, even intimate. But historically, it emerged from dependency as much as partnership. Britain needed American power. America could choose its terms. And that is the central irony at the heart of this story. Britain did not lose the empire in a single dramatic collapse. Britain liquidated it. Not always officially, not always with one signature, but through a chain of necessities: selling assets, leasing bases, accepting trade clauses, abandoning commitments, because survival demanded it. When Churchill wrote to Roosevelt in December 1940, he was fighting for Britain's immediate life. He did what he had to do. The alternative was unthinkable: defeat, occupation, darkness across Europe. But that letter marked a turning point. It was the moment Britain admitted it could not finance its own salvation. And once that admission was made, the relationship between Britain and America could never be equal again. Britain survived Nazi Germany, but it emerged exhausted, indebted, and economically hollowed out. It emerged as a moral giant, respected for standing alone, for refusing surrender, for enduring the Blitz. And yet economically, it emerged smaller. Its imperial system weakened, its finances constrained, its global dominance transferred. The war proved that courage can hold the line, but it cannot pay the bill. Britain paid the bill anyway by selling pieces of its future. That is the price of survival in the age of industrial total war. Not merely blood and rubble, but capital, influence, market share, strategic position, the quiet mechanisms of power. Britain won, and in winning, it spent the inheritance of an empire. Thank you for watching. If you want to understand how economies rise and fall, how wealth is created and destroyed, and what history's greatest cautionary tales teach us about our own time, make sure to subscribe. These patterns repeat, and understanding them might be the most valuable knowledge you can possess. We'll see you in the next one.